Well, in order to introduce our speaker this evening, I'd like to call upon Tom Mullins, who's been a wonderful supporter both of the Royal Oak Foundation and of the Boston Athenaeum. Tom.
Thank you, Richard, for that warm welcome, and let me return the sentiments and say how delighted the Royal Oak Foundation is to be co-sponsoring this lecture with our friends at the Boston Athenaeum. The Boston Athenaeum relationship with the Royal Oak is one we value very highly, and our thanks go to Richard and his splendid staff, most particularly Monica Higgins, for all their help in the planning and implementation of this program. Tonight's lecture is the first of two that the Royal Oak is presenting with the Boston Athenaeum this season. As the American membership affiliate of Britain's National Trust, the Royal Oak offers these lectures as part of our educational mission to foster a deeper understanding of the cultural ties that unite Britain and the United States. It's wonderful to have the continuing support of the Athenaeum, and we're glad that they count so many Anglophiles among their members. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture, The Exiled Collector, William Banks and the Making of an English Country House, and to introduce our noted speaker, Anne Sebba. Anne is a prolific author, lecturer, and one-time foreign correspondent for Reuters. She brings the gifts of an accomplished reporter, historian, biographer, and social commentator to her subject. Her illustrated talk this evening tells a poignant story of how a personal indiscretion turned tragedy in the life of William Banks was converted to a lasting gift of his collections held at the magnificent family home of Kingston Lacy in Dorset, which happens to be a National Trust property. This presentation, coincidentally, gives us some perceptive insights into the manners and morals of the upper class in early Victorian Britain. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, Anne Sebba.
Thank you for that very warm welcome. I think I'm ready for the lights. And the first slide. June the 6th, 1833, and it's a balmy summer evening. Just right for an evening stroll, in fact, through the churchyard between Westminster Abbey and St. Margaret's Church. That's the one opposite the old Houses of Parliament before they burnt down. And if you'd been there at 35 minutes past 9 o'clock, you might have seen a night watchman by the name of Smith. He's done the same job for many years. He comes on duty at about 8 o'clock, and every night he walks from the western gates around by Poets' Corner, and then he returns to the western gates, and there isn't usually very much for him to see. But on this night, he sees two people. Now, all he could tell at this point was that one was dressed as a soldier in the uniform of the Foot Guards, and the other was obviously a gentleman. He knew that from his cloak, and they were talking together. Well, what should he do? Nothing much at the moment. He just observes. I mean, that, after all, is his job. And it's not a crime to have a conversation, surely. But then the gentleman, the one in the cloak, goes off to a watering place, a stone building constructed in the angle between the tower and the body of St. Margaret's Church. It's not very big. There's really only room for one man to relieve himself at a time. However, Smith then sees the soldier leave the churchyard. And where does he go? Back to barracks? Oh, no. No, he goes into the same little stone watering place, big enough, if you remember, only for one person to relieve themselves at a time. Smith takes a mere second to realize he must fetch a witness, but there weren't many people around at that point, so he accosts a complete stranger, a man by the name of Barker. "Watch the stone watering place," he says, "and don't let anyone come out of there. Now, I'm on my way to find a police constable." Smith runs off to the House of Commons, the most likely place in those days to find a police constable, leaving poor bewildered Barker standing there. But that night there was no police constable on duty, so he runs back to tell Barker, "You'll have to stand guard. I'll stand guard while you run off to Tothill Street." Now that's a good 5 minutes away on foot. As quick as he can, Barker comes back this time and he's found a police constable, Constable Edwards. Now, however fast they ran, this must have taken 10 to 15 minutes. And as Constable Edwards returned with Night Watchman Smith, the gentleman in the cloak is just emerging from the same stone watering place, along with the soldier, who had the rather beautiful name, as we learn later, Private Flowers. Both men were immediately arrested and taken to Tothill Street Police Station, where they were formally charged. But they wouldn't be able to see a magistrate until the morning. As you can imagine, Renter Mob was soon alerted to the exciting fact that a well-known gentleman, a Tory MP no less, had been arrested, charged with meeting another man for unnatural purposes. They were being held pending a decision by the magistrate, and this was good sport for the mob. They were shrieking for his blood. Things like, "It's a rich man, and it's a filthy crime. He deserves the worst. Let him be hanged." So, with these loud and vicious cries ringing in his ears, William John Banks, the famous explorer of Egypt and Nubia, the Cambridge friend of Byron, and there you see him, Lord Byron, the double heir to Corfe Castle and Kingston Lacy in Dorset and Sugton in Wales, tries to sleep the night, his very first night in a prison cell. He was charged by a magistrate the following day with indecent exposure, and his case was to come before the Court of King's Bench in 6 months' time. Now, had it been indecent assault or sodomy, he would have faced death by hanging. They did still hang people in England. That very year, another man had been hanged for exactly the same crime. Even so, it was still a pretty serious charge. Fast forward 6 months to a cold December day, the day of his trial here in the Court of King's Bench. William Banks and his father had worked very hard with the family lawyer to do their best for the son and heir, and they've assembled a rich cast of Victorian worthies to plead that the defendant is, well, such a manly man, of such good character, he couldn't possibly be guilty of such a horrific, filthy crime. The prosecution was led by a pompous, somewhat boorish Edinburgh lawyer called Campbell. He declared that the defendants were charged with an offence which was forbidden both by the laws of God and man, and which was degrading to human nature. So it was of the utmost importance that persons guilty of such wicked, lewd, immoral, and unnatural offences should be punished whatever might be their situation in life and however noble their character. Campbell then got bogged down in a mass of detail about buttons and belts and braces and flaps, and whether or not William Banks's undershirt and linen had been showing at the time he was arrested. However, Banks had a brilliant defence lawyer, Sir James Scarlett no less, who quickly made mincemeat of all of this. Edwards the policeman said he was absolutely certain he'd seen both Banks and Flowers in the stone enclosure together. Had he seen them? Actually seen them? "Are you quite sure?" Scarlett asked him, and there was a silence. Just as sure as you were about the state of Mr. Banks's trousers and whether they were undone in front or whether the flap was down?" "Oh, yes, the flap was definitely down." "But, Mr. Edwards," replied Scarlett, savouring every moment of this, "Mr. Banks's trousers had no flap. They were buttoned in front." Well, from then on, Scarlett was on a winning ticket, and he loved it. He called witness after witness, all these Victorian worthies who attested not only to William's manly character, but to his brave exploits in Egypt. After all, William at this point was something of a national celebrity. You see, he had spent more than 10 years travelling in Egypt. And when he was there and he'd visited the island of Philae, he'd seen the ancient Egyptian obelisk, which he'd lugged back. It had taken him nearly 20 years finally to have it erected. But in 1827, the Duke of Wellington had come to lay the foundation stone, and he was really pretty famous for this object. Most people, when they think of ancient Egyptian obelisks in London, they think of Cleopatra's Needle, but actually that was only erected in 1879 rather, and it was anyway not so early as this is a 14th century BC obelisk, and it was one of a pair that would have guarded the entrance to the Temple of Isis. And when William Banks had seen it on his travels in Egypt, he knew immediately that he absolutely had to have this as a, well, souvenir, really. I mean, it's a bit of an extravagant souvenir, but he knew instantly that he wanted this to decorate his garden in Dorset. And here's a close-up, or it should be a close-up. There we have a close-up of the obelisk, from which you can see it's slightly damaged. You can't really tell what a beautiful colour pink granite it is. It's worn away by the weather and moss, but you can see the ancient hieroglyphics on this, and William became something of an expert in the current decipherment debate. Remember, the Rosetta Stone had just been brought back, and the English and French were having a race, which actually the French won, I'm sorry to say. Champollion got there first, and William was on the losing side. He was helping Dr. Thomas Young, but he was a real scholar and an epigrapher, and he worked at the decipherment of the hieroglyphics thanks to this obelisk. So I've digressed a little bit from his trial just to try and set the scene of why he was so famous at the time of his trial. He wasn't simply a Tory MP. Anyway, back to the trial. First up on the witness stand was the headmaster of Harrow School, George Butler, a family friend. Then there was Samuel Rogers, the banker poet, another one who greatly admired William and all that he had done and discovered on his travels. Then there was a Dr. Hughes from Mould in Flintshire, and this doctor testified that William was a patient with such a rare bladder condition that often he simply could not urinate for 24 hours, and of course, when he finally was able to go, he had to spend much longer than most people trying to pass water, which of course explains why he was in the stone enclosure for so long. But the prime witness was, you've guessed it, the Duke of Wellington, a family friend who had laid the foundation stone in 1827 for this obelisk and who greatly liked William. Now the Duke, in measured tones, told how when William had followed him into battle in Spain, and of course William had gone there not to fight, he'd gone there to loot all these wonderful treasures that were tumbling out of convents. But anyway, the Duke of Wellington, in spite of a little bit of looting, rather liked William. And he said that when William was involved in a brawl, he had fought back in such a manly way, and this was the key word, manly, that the Duke of Wellington presented him afterwards with a watch as a present. And as soon as the Duke of Wellington uttered these words, really the trial was all over, effectively, because the Duke had pronounced. This was not simply a manly man, but he was not a Uranist, a sodomite, a Methodist, or a pederast, or whatever insult was poured upon men in those days. And if you remember, none of the witnesses could actually prove that William and Private Flowers had been seen together in the stone watering place. They'd only seen them out of it. So the case collapsed. William was acquitted because all gentlemen could get off their first case, and he was allowed to walk free without the slightest stain on his character. Now, the following year, 1834, William's father died, Henry Banks. And there's the upright, independent MP, Henry Banks, who always rather despaired of his wayward, artistic son, William. And some said that Henry Banks, who had defended his son to the last, died of a broken heart. And finally, William, aged 48, having been heir in waiting for so long, I mean, it really often reminds me of Prince Charles, heir for too long, but anyway, William did inherit at 48. He became Master of Kingston Lacy at last. And this shows you more or less what the house looked like at the time that William inherited, before he made all the changes that he was dying to do. He immediately set about the remodeling that his heart had been set on for ages. You see, he'd met Charles Barry when they'd both been travelling up the Nile, quite coincidentally. Their boats had just met like that. And Charles Barry in that year was completely unknown. He was taking a year off before he became the famous architect that he subsequently did. And William was very helpful in getting Charles Barry all sorts of early commissions to design churches. And he said to Barry, when I inherit finally, I want you to come and do the work on Kingston Lacy. And of course, at that point, Charles Barry said he'd be delighted to. He wasn't famous. By the time William came round to asking him, William was not only famous, he was notorious. So Charles Barry was slightly less keen to do the work, but he'd made a promise, so of course he did. But really, William Banks must have been a terribly difficult patron, an architect manqué, if ever there was one, with the most precise ideas about what should be done and where and how. And now you see William at the time he inherited. This is a miniature by George Hayter, which was done for the big study of all the members of Parliament before the Great Reform Act in 1832. And I like it. There are very few images of William, sadly. There are just the two that I've now shown you. I think you can see that he's got a few grey hairs, but and blue eyes still. He's got a very nice face, open and honest, and sensitive and artistic. I think you can see a lot of his character in that picture, so I'm very fond of that. But, after a few years of remodelling the house, in 1841, William goes and does it again. Only this time he gets caught in Green Park in flagranti with another soldier. And this time the soldier, being so much younger and fitter, just sprints away like that. And guess who's caught? It's William, who this time is charged with the much more serious indecent assault with, as the weighty Victorian indictment stated, the crime which cannot be named among Christians, but it is buggery. And this indictment, which says exactly that, was kept by his family who really, on balance, were extremely supportive. But this crime, William and his Cambridge contemporaries, amongst them Byron, of course, they knew about only too clearly. They took some pleasure in mocking it, but they mocked it very carefully. Other than William, who was, of course, a risk-taker. William, in his travels, had been a risk-taker. He'd undertaken all sorts of dangerous trips. He'd gone to Petra, which at that point was an extremely dangerous thing for a white Westerner to do, but he was determined to draw the treasury, and he did. Bringing his obelisk back, which of course didn't really belong to him. How could you lay claim to an obelisk? But he just paid the British consul Henry Salt and expected it to be delivered back, and of course it was. And in his private life, he was a risk-taker too, and so this is what happened to him. And he understood immediately the penalty of his crime. He actually gave a false name. I mean, his sense of fear is absolutely palpable. He gave a false name, he tried bribery, but nothing worked. And so he knew he faced a very serious charge, and advised by his lawyer that this time he really might be hanged, and he risked not only his life, and I really believe that actually William would have stood trial and risked his life. That wasn't it, but when the lawyer said to him that the government could seize his entire estates and properties and goods, this meant so much to him, the bank's legacy, the bank's dynasty that finally had come to him, he simply could not risk forfeiting that to the government. So he listened to his lawyer, and he swiftly passed everything over in trust form to his two brothers and a nephew, and he fled the country. He recognised it was possibly for good. He just packed all he needed quickly in a bag for a week, and his servant was sent over later with more. He kissed goodbye to the walls of the house that he loved so much, and he took a final long look at the Spanish room, or the golden room, which was his pride and joy. Now, you're seeing it there more or less finished, but of course when William said goodbye, none of the treasures were in place. That was what he was to devote the rest of his life to. He had, however, bought this ceiling, which is an absolutely magnificent piece of work from a Venice palazzo, and he bought it in bits and pieces. All his life, William collected for decorative purposes. That was really what motivated him, to see how a thing would look in situ. So when he bought this ceiling from a dealer in London, actually, and he had all the other bits and pieces assembled to make it work in the Spanish and Golden Room. And this was where he wanted to hang his youthful treasures, the Spanish paintings that he'd bought and or looted while he'd been following the Duke of Wellington, and all the other things that he was subsequently to acquire and decorate were to go into the Spanish room. So he said goodbye, not quite knowing where he was going, but he crossed the Channel at night and went first to France on his way to Italy. Well, is all this just a story that I've been telling you, or is there actually a deeper significance to it all? And obviously, I think there's a deeper significance, otherwise I wouldn't have spent 3 years plus researching and writing about it all. For me, the issue of the use and abuse of morality in politics is as topical and as controversial today in both America and England as it was then. Victorian society, so often portrayed as repressed, was actually deeply interested in sex, and adultery was rife. But you see, adultery was okay because it was manly. The establishment was really terrified of homosexuality. What would happen if you allowed it openly? Because clearly it was going on privately, but they saw homosexuality as the sort of soft underbelly of revolutionary France creeping in. You know, if you allowed that, what on earth would follow next? Now, it was all right, of course, if it was done tactfully in private. William's real crime was that he did it in public, and he flouted the establishment of which he was part. Not one of them, you'll notice, came to his rescue. Most reviewers of my book have described the life of William Banks as a very poignant story, and actually I'm not quite sure that it is. I happen to think this was a man who would have dissipated his life if he'd remained in England, decorating his house, attending posh dinners, going to the Society of Dilettanti, and, well, so what? What would it all have amounted to? Not very much, and I certainly don't think I would have been here tonight talking to you all if that was what had happened, because actually I think exile was what proved the making of William Banks. It proved his robustness in a time of crisis, and it really enabled him to find powers within himself that he never would have needed if he'd stayed at home. He created a gem from exile, and it stands today as a testament to one man's will against a narrow and vindictive establishment. I don't want to go too far in this. I mean, I'm not going to take William on as a sort of left-wing, revolutionary, anti-establishment fighter for gay rights. I mean, he wasn't anything like that. But what he did was he found an occupation, really a job, or the closest anyone of his inclination, his standing, could come to having a job in Italy. And it was certainly something that never would have happened to him if he had stayed in England. Now, as I said, he didn't go immediately to Venice. He had no plans. He had to do everything in such a hurry. He went first to France. But there was a chance of extradition from France. So when he realized this, he moved on to Italy. And anyway, he spoke the language in Italy. He liked the climate. He felt much more at home. And he had fond memories of going to visit his Cambridge friend, Lord Byron, during Byron's self-imposed exile there 20 years earlier. I wish I knew precisely where he lived in Venice, dark, seductive and magical Venice, but he was terribly careful never to give his address. I think this was partly to protect his family. I mean, he didn't want them to be involved in his crime in any way, so his letters were always addressed poste restante. Occasionally an address creeps through, perhaps because one of the craftsmen he knew were careless. And occasionally he moved into a hotel. And you'll be pleased to know, although he had absolutely no money, I mean, he lived on the interest that his brothers allowed him. It was really very little, but he lived very frugally. However, he did, when he moved into hotels, stay in nice ones. Those of you who know Verona will know Le Due Torre. It's still a very nice hotel. And when he was in Venice, briefly during the siege, he moved into the Europa in Venice. The Europa isn't quite the Danieli, I know, where the Ruskins stayed and where others later, including Churchill, stayed, but it's okay. It was good enough for Turner, actually, and Turner painted a gorgeous view from a bedroom window, which might well have been the same bedroom, I like to imagine, where William stayed. But anyway, exile without funds or friends that he had been used to is not very pleasant, and it would test anybody, and it certainly tested William. What did he do every day now that he no longer had a house to worry about, this house that had totally occupied him for a scant 7 years? Well, of course he couldn't shake it off that easily, and he still worried about the house obsessively, but he no longer owned it. And in addition, he had no real money, so his major buying sprees as a collector were over. What he did instead was truly inventive. He went around drawing, sketching, measuring, having his poor beleaguered steward at home send him over exact and precise measurements. Now just look at this wonderful drawing that his steward Seymour made by candlelight in 1849. And you realise that either Seymour was a brilliant but self-taught man of enormous talent, or else that William was a good teacher, probably a bit of both. So this is what the house looked like after Charles Barry had had a go. Now, the main changes are that he encased the house in Chilmark stone. William's main idea was to create an Italian palazzo in the heart of the then extremely wild Dorset countryside. And I think it does have the look of an Italian palazzo. The other things that he did, you can see a new balustrade. The cupola was new, and the tall chimney pieces. William firmly believed that the house had originally been designed by Inigo Jones. He was wrong. So he went round, he sent Charles Barry to look at all Inigo Jones' houses and copy all that he could to make it look like an Inigo Jones house. But the real changes William made were to the inside. He wanted a house with greater modernity. And he lowered the entrance hall. He took it away from the north side and made it underground with a porte cochere so that guests arriving would be sheltered from the rain and wind, which, as I've said, was very extreme in that part of Dorset. He had in mind that there would be great parties held in this house. Of course, there never were. He had a small party just before he left, but those were really the main changes. And what he intended to do was have wonderful treasures inside, and now you'll find out how he still managed to do that in spite of being an exile. So for a few years, William settled down in Italy, and he didn't do very much except sort out his own affairs, find out how much money he had to spend. Slowly, he went around discovering craftsmen, sketching and copying and ordering, and then eventually he started sending it all back to England. Now, the radical thing that he did was to find these craftsmen, because really craftsmen were not as we admire crafts today. They were considered very second or actually fifth rate. They weren't real artists, they weren't painters. So for William to commission craftsmen and discover them, and he built up an amazing network all over northern Italy, was pretty radical. The pattern he established was that William would have a template made, probably from something he had copied himself, and then he would take it to one or other of the craftsmen he'd discovered. And the other thing he discovered were McCrackens, the shipping agents, and the way to send stuff home to Poole. He was absolutely methodical, I mean, really obsessive, or as some people would say, neurotic, but he numbered every single item and sent precise instructions as to where they were to go and how they were to be refitted. And often this poor steward, Seymour, wrote back, "What an error the men in Italy has made. It does not fit." And then William would reply in his brusque manner, "Well, then go to Portland and have knots of Wimborne make up another block to match. Have it made as near as you can to match it." So among the treasures that ended up in Kingston Lacy this way were... Now, this is a painting which William bought much earlier in 1815. He believed it was the Holy Family by Raphael, and actually it's now a circle of Raphael, sadly. William did get a few attributions wrong, but you can't really blame him for that. Anyway, what William had done during his exile was this rather beautiful but heavy carved frame. And the reason that William wanted this was he wanted cartouches made around the frame to contain the names of the previous owners. Provenance was extremely important for William. He wanted his place in the history of things to be permanently remembered for history. So amongst the previous owners of this painting, and you can say that they got the attribution wrong too, were King Charles I and Vincenzo Gonzaga, the 4th Duke of Mantua. So I don't think William did too badly. And this frame came back very late on in William's exile, but it was one of the most important things that mattered to him. He also had dozens of wellheads made. He wasn't one of those Englishmen who just stole the ancient Italian heritage. He did actually buy 1 or 2 original wellheads, but mostly he was just as happy to have them cast and copied. And here's a particularly fine wellhead decorated with cherubs and garlands, which is now on the south lawn and made according to William's designs. William had quite a team of carvers in Verona, actually, who all excelled at making wellheads. And one of his red marble examples, as he told his sister Anne, was copied at Verona, full size, from one in the court of a palace of the Bevilacqua family by the Montresor workshop. Another, and I quote, "on which I have endeavoured to represent, by boys, the 4 seasons, is my most considerable design in figures, and it was carved in Istrian marble by Angelo Giordani." William really understood the importance of uniting the house and lawn. I think you can see that this is one of the red stone lions that he commissioned from Giuseppe Petrelli of Padua in January 1848. It's also on the south lawn. Those of you who've been to Rome will know that it's actually a copy. I mean, it's much smaller, but it's a copy of the ones at the foot of the Capitol in Rome. And with the light shining on it, the red, I don't think it shows clearly enough in that slide, but it really is one of the most beautiful things in the garden of Kingston Lacy. He was also extremely fond of wood carvings in the style of that very English carver, Grinling Gibbons. And you can see here a close view of the walnut shutters in the dining room. We know these were never put up in William's lifetime, although he saw them because they were carved from his own designs. But by the time they came home and his brother George got round to it, it was too late. And there's a more detailed one here. I mean, the work is really of a very, very high standard for people who previously would just be dismissed as craftsmen. Now, among my personal favourites in the whole of Kingston Lacy are the 4 boxwood shutters in the dining room. And this one is an angel playing the pipes carved by Vincenzo Favenza and copied from Donatello's high altar in the Santo at Padua. I think you can see what William loved about cherubs, can't you? They are absolutely divine putty. I mean, he copied it very faithfully, but there's just a lovely cheeky look. You can understand why William loved them so much. But Favenza, who was one of his favourite carvers, William decided to give Favenza his head. And one of the most extraordinarily high Victorian, over-the-top, ridiculously ornate projects, which sadly was never finished in William's lifetime, is this bed in walnut and holly. And it has multiple symbols of bats, Old Father Time, the Bank's coats of arms, and of course more cupids to help him sleep, although he never slept in it. I mean, you do wonder why William was so desperately keen to have a bed made for the state bedroom when he knew he was never going to come back to Kingston Lacy. But he really cared about finishing the project of the house. And whether or not it was going to be him or one of his brother's descendants, it didn't seem to matter. He just desperately wanted everything as it would have been if he'd still been in England. Although, of course, if he'd been in England, he would never have had access to these high standard of Italian craftspeople. I don't know if you can see it also. This bed also has some pre-Raphaelite nymphs. I think there's another slide which shows it. Pre-Raphaelite nymphs and winged Roman soldiers and tortoises. So he really got his metaphors thoroughly mixed up. And not surprisingly, after his death, his brothers didn't want to pay for all of it. So the British consul, the poor man, was left to sort out all the mess. In addition to getting William's body home when he died, he had to cancel a lot of contracts to craftspeople and just say to Favenza, stop in the middle, it doesn't matter if you're not finished, there's no more money. Actually, tortoises. William was particularly fond of tortoises. He boasted once that he carried a bag of live tortoises all the way to Paris. He wanted tortoises as a base for various objects. Torchères and wellheads. Well, when you go to Kingston Lacy, and some of you probably already have been, do count them. I think there are about 20, but I lost track after a while. There are certainly lots of them, and here are some tortoises supporting vases on the south lawn. I've really tried to think about the significance of tortoises for William, and I've talked about it with lots of art historians, but none of the traditional explanations seem to work for me. Art historians say that they're a metaphor for constancy, devotion to housework, I think, or hell. I mean, various explanations. And then it suddenly dawned on me, it's so obvious in William's case. Here's a man who carried his house on his back, or at least not on his back, really, his house in his mind. So for me, the metaphor of a tortoise has obvious resonance for William. Now, the thing which William really loved was marble. And he became a complete expert on the sources of marble in Italy, the different types and variety of marble, and how it was cut. He obviously spent hours watching the craftsmen cut it until he considered he was an expert himself. Now look closely at the long relief of dancing putti. Again, he loved these putti, commissioned by Banks, this time from Pietro Laurendini, and copied from works by Della Robbia and Donatello. These have been executed in a special two-tone marble. It's white on the surface and orange-red within. And there's some other marble work there, the mythical birds that he was very keen on as well. And the relief is, again, rather fine work. Now, so far, most of what we've seen are William's designs made up by skilled craftsmen. But William, of course, wanted to do more. He really was a very talented artist himself. He'd learnt painting from his mother, Frances Banks, who was the former Frances Woodley. And you can see her, here she is in a gorgeous painting by Romney. This is before her marriage. And I love this painting because it shows her very elongated neck. Romney was a master of making women more beautiful, and he knew how to do. One of the ways to do this was to give women a longer neck, but he also put her in these gorgeous classical gowns. I think she looks lovely there. And here we have a slide of William's sister, Anne. Not quite such a beautiful painting. Sir Thomas Lawrence was the painter. William adored Anne, and they had a very close relationship, and they both learnt painting at home together. I suspect that William's mother was the teacher, Frances Banks, but they had other artists who came. William simply couldn't be a painter in England. It was just not acceptable as an occupation for a man who was going to be the owner of Kingston Lacy. So he was never really well enough trained. Being a painter just was not, to come back to this awful word again, it was not manly enough. So his forte was always architectural details And there you see, I mean, that was typical. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, actually, of these drawings in his papers. You can see his spidery handwriting with great detail as to where it was to go, where it was copied from, or how he wanted it used. And that was the sort of thing, painstakingly accurate architectural details, which William excelled at. But the point is, once he was in Italy, he really could let go, and he really could be the painter that he always knew he wanted to be. And for me, this is one of the 12 months of the year, a panel in his much beloved Spanish room for the pearwood doors. So you see, he could pursue the activity that he loved. And there were 4 doors to the Spanish room, which all had various panels representing the months of the year. And as he wrote to his beloved sister Anne, he really thought these were his finest works ever. And actually, I think we see the fullest expression of his talent, the exuberance in these works. It could be that he just did the outline and he found a young boy to paint the colours, but I think he did most of the work himself. And it seems to me that these, I've got some of the others to see, April, May and September, I think I'm able to show you. I think they're gorgeous. And they show a man who really was not frightened or fearful. Everything about these doors shows somebody who was still vigorous, in love with life. They're very fresh to me. He became really very obsessive once he was in Italy. I've told you how he became an expert not only on the different types of marble and how you could cut it, but once he knew what he was doing, he drove a very hard bargain with his craftsmen. A lot of them argued with him a lot. He also drove his brother mad with all the precise instructions that he sent back. And here you see not William's brother, but the wife of William's brother, Georgiana. And I wanted to show you this with only 3 of her 12 children, because she really was the perfect wife. And it seems to me that it represents such a total polar opposite of what William was. This painting, incidentally, is by Sir William Ross in 1830. I love the way William was, in all the letters, so scornful of George. George was much more like their father. He was terribly upright and correct. William considered he just had no artistic understanding, so it rather annoyed him that he had to give instructions to George, who really didn't like being lectured to, although, George had been lucky enough to inherit Kingston Lacy, so William thought he should be jolly grateful for that and just get on with the instructions, and if William sent over a trunkload of stuff to be put up, then William should just get on and do it. But some of William's instructions were, if you have nothing else to do, why don't you try out the effect of a stone wash on this wall? Or, when you're next at Kingston Lacy and idle, why don't you try out this painting on the ceiling and see what it looked like? So, they had lots of rows in the letters, and one of my favourite put-down remarks from William to George is the following. I do believe it is cruel to have spoiled the glorious pair of doors between the 2 great rooms by putting handles in the wrong place, and where no handles ever are in Italian doors, and of all things in the world, oak knobs in a room where there is gilding. Can't you just hear William's scorn in that? Wonderful, isn't it? One of the last, and for William the most important projects that he worked on in exile was the group of figures, the conversation piece, the amazing bronze sculptures by Baron Carlo Marochetti, to which he devoted his declining years. Although actually he knew Marochetti before his downfall, and he discussed the idea before he went into exile, but once he was abroad, this took on a new and very real urgency. In fact, he even travelled to Paris to meet Marochetti to discuss it further. He borrowed the robes of the Chief Justice from his niece, and he bombarded Marochetti with instructions. And yet, once again, poor William never saw the finished statues. Now, for William, this really was a key statement. And it was significant that he made the statement almost immediately that you walked up the marble staircase. Now, this marble staircase William did see before he left. I'll digress for a minute here because he copied this staircase from the Ruspoli Palace in Rome. And typical of his obsessiveness, he told Charles Barry that he wanted it, and he had a measured plan sent over from Rome, and all the stair pieces arrived in numbered portions, and it was sent to Poole in 100 pieces and had to be reassembled. But you see, it worked, and William saw it before he left. Now, as you came up this marble staircase, you turn into the loggia, and it's the loggia that I'm talking about, where the marble statues are. And it's the loggia where, well, that's brave Dame Mary, because she was the one, you see the key of Corfe Castle in her hand. It was she who really immortalised for William the values that the Banks family represented. And so, William wanted his own place in the Banks family to be assured. You see, this was the piece of art that would make sure that William was, even though his children weren't going to inherit, of course it was George's children, William would be part of this. So there's brave Dame Mary, who's responsible for holding out against the siege of Corfe Castle. Here's her husband, Sir John Banks. Sir John actually was advisor to King Charles I, and he died in 1644. And these were the ancestors who William wanted. And here is the bas-relief of Corfe Castle that was also terribly important. And William researched in great detail the sort of armour that the soldiers would have worn. And you can see Corfe Castle at the top there before it's destroyed. Although the ruins, of course, still belonged to the Banks family and were central to this whole story. And now you see the conversation piece. There are the bronzes. You can see brave Dame Mary with the keys in her hand. William was a bit worried that if the key was too large, she'd look like a housekeeper. I mean, these sort of details were really important to William. And there's King Charles, and the bas-relief of Corfe Castle sits beneath him. And you can't get the third statue, which was King John, and it would just about be in the front of the audience. So that loggia, which, really is an incredible piece of art, if you think about it, to have in a private house. But it was the piece of art that for William stated whatever England had done to him, he loved the monarchy and he forgave the establishment of which he knew he was an indissoluble part. Now, I said earlier that most reviewers have said what a poignant story it is, but that I don't altogether see it that way. And this remark is usually made in the context of, but he never came back to see all his treasures. And I'm sure I've said during this talk, oh, how sad it is he didn't see this, how sad he didn't see the other. But actually, although I don't believe he came back regularly, which is what the family myth would have us believe, I really do believe he came home once towards the end when he knew he was dying. We've established he was a risk-taker, so why wouldn't he? It's so obvious in a way, isn't it? And there are memos to this long-suffering steward which make it fairly likely, in particular, he wanted to make sure that the marble for the marble niches in the saloon was cut properly. So, we know from the memos where he says, to mine eye, things don't look quite correct, and the way I see it. So, you see, these marble niches were very special. They had 3 different types of marble. I don't know if you can quite see. The shells have a yellow Torre marble. The architraves are biancone. And there's purple and white on the marble on the backs. So, these really were very special. And William undoubtedly came back once in 1854 to ensure that this marble was cut properly. And the reason, apart from the memos, that I am absolutely convinced he did is a meeting I had with the descendants of Isaac Gulliver. Isaac Gulliver was the most famous Dorset smuggler of all time. And it's a story that once I heard it made such good sense. You see, it wouldn't be written down, would it? Because they weren't fools. If you write it down, they would, they knew it was a criminal conviction that they faced, helping a criminal to come back to England. But in 1854, when William knew he was dying and there were problems to be sorted out, he called upon the descendants of Isaac Gulliver, because in days gone past, the Banks family had helped Isaac Gulliver and his mates smuggle the odd bottle of brandy across, or whatever it was they needed, and turned a blind eye to that. So, they'd helped him. Now it was their turn to help William. And they knew each other through Poole Harbour, and the descendants of Isaac Gulliver had become respectable men. They controlled the magistracy, they controlled banks. I don't mean banks with an E, I mean literally banks. So, this whole connection was enough to ensure that when William came back for one day, he was not going to be arrested. And these descendants of Isaac Gulliver knew this story. They'd been told it through the generations, that when the time came for William to come back once, they were going to make sure he was not arrested. And frankly, that was good enough for me. They knew that this had happened, although, of course, he would never have seen the Marochetti sculptures because they weren't finished. Anyway, this story is enough to make me believe that if he died not exactly a happy man, he was certainly a satisfied and fulfilled man. According to an 1858 inventory, however, many of William's bits and pieces were still in boxes and crates. So 3 years after his death, nothing had happened to a lot of the stuff that he had sent back. Somebody once said to me, this book is really, you should say it's all about sex and shopping, because in a way it is. In his obsessive, neurotic way, whenever he'd seen a bargain, he'd bought it, and he thought, well, this will come in somehow or other, they'll use it. But of course his brothers hadn't been able to use it, and more to the point, they hadn't been that interested in using it. So I'm afraid there still are at Kingston Lacy lots of boxes and crates of numbered marble pieces and broken wood that just couldn't be used everywhere, that William had hoped his brother George could use. The sad part for me, actually, is that he really was unappreciated until relatively recently, until, in fact, the House joined the National Trust in 1981, and finally William's part in its creation could once again be recognised. There is a short postscript to this talk. Weeks after writing the book, I was giving a talk a bit like this in my hometown of Richmond in Surrey. And afterwards, as I was signing, a man introduced himself as an architect and said to me, did I know about William Banks's rooms in Trinity College, Cambridge? And I said, well, yes, of course, I know he was at Trinity, but I'd written to the librarian there and nobody had known precisely where his rooms were. Oh, yes, we do, the man replied very brightly after my book had been written. A friend of mine works for an architectural firm in Cambridge, and some years ago they uncovered or excavated the exact rooms in which William lived. They're extraordinary, the man told me. We believe they're the only set of rooms in Cambridge which were completely rebuilt by an undergraduate. They have Gothic tracery, he told me, a sort of 19th century double glazing at the windows, an arched and vaulted ceiling, painted shields. Nobody actually knows what these shields were. I mean, it's William's imagination. They're not a known symbol. And gargoyles. And the wall is painted in the style of a Renaissance fresco. And we believe William himself painted this fresco. Why, oh why, had the college authorities not told me when I'd written to them about this? Well, he could offer no explanation, but he did invite me to come up and see them for myself later that year, which of course I did, and I was mesmerised by them. Not so much by them as what they told me about William's character. Such certainty of his own style. I mean, it was verging on the arrogance which I had already grown to know and love by researching his later life, but it rather changed my understanding of William Banks as a young man, and it helped me understand why Byron, as an undergraduate, was so in awe of him. Of course, it was too late for my book, and I was devastated, although, such things do happen to authors post-publication. But anyway, I'm really delighted that I'm able to show these slides to you today. And there's the fresco. You can see a little bit of it. It's been preserved with a glass panel in front. So I'm delighted that at least I can show these to you, since nobody else knows about these Cambridge rooms. And finally, here are some pictures of how the house looked after William died. Here's a wedding in 1897. I love to see how the house is used, and I think it really does have the look of an Italian palazzo in that picture. That's Walter Ralph Banks marrying Henrietta Fraser. He was the last owner but one. And some others, which I love that too, shows the house in snow. Just so that you get the idea of the house in different moods and different seasons, and you can see the wellheads that William was so fond of very clearly. And I think you really do get an impression of a gem, an Italian palazzo in the heart of the Dorset countryside. I suppose for me the charm of the house is that it's not too big. It's not like Blenheim or Chatsworth, which somehow are magnificent but so enormous it's really very hard to understand how life was lived there. For me, the charm of Kingston Lacy is that it is small and you can absolutely get a feel if you go there, and I really strongly hope you do, is precisely how life was lived and would have been lived by William if he had stayed there. So thank you very much. You've been a great audience, staying awake for me. Do we have time? Okay. I'm told we have time for one or two questions. I don't know if any. Otherwise, I'm happy to talk to you afterwards over a drink, if anyone has any questions. Yes, at the back. Are you asking me which college at Cambridge? Trinity. Where are the rooms? Well, as you go in, past the wonderful fountain, they're on your left. But you'd probably better ask the porter, I guess, although, you know, when I asked, nobody knew. I went, there is this special firm of architects called Donald Insall, whose job it is to maintain all the ancient buildings, and you know, there are a lot of treasures in Cambridge, so they have a sort of roving commission to maintain everything. As soon as they've finished one, they do another. And that was how I was put onto it. Nobody that I wrote to seemed to know anything about it, but of course, you know, once you find out, you think, how on earth could they not know? Sorry, I didn't hear that.
The connection that Boston has to William Banks and Philip IV by the last post.
Which is, are you going to tell me what the connection is?
In those days, the occasion that for a king to have several paintings done of himself, not four, and then people would sketch them when he would be going someplace to give them out. There were four of them, Philip IV in Spain, two of which are here in Boston. One at the Museum of Fine Arts, but the one that William Banks bought was put up for sale in the late 1800s. I believe they probably needed money to teach the Lacy.
Yes.
And it happened that Berenson was in Rome around London when it was auctioned, and he purchased it. And today, the same painting hangs in the Victorian Museum.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Else? Or else I'm happy to... Nobody knows the greatest frustration. The point about his death is that it was deeply humiliating. You know, this was not only a criminal, he was an outlaw. And to understand why the government made him an outlaw, I consulted some legal historians to try and understand this myself. And they said to me at first, oh, he wouldn't have been made an outlaw. That was an archaic practice. Nobody was made an outlaw. But I knew he had been. There it was in the correspondence. And when I showed them, they were absolutely flabbergasted and said it must have been the government being greedy. They wanted to get their hands on this amazing estate. You know, if you put that in context, there were no obituaries of William Banks. There was a tiny paragraph in the Gentleman magazine just saying he died lately in Venice. So the fact that you don't know what he died from is, I suppose, understandable, but he could have died from a cholera outbreak that there was at the time of his death. But I don't think so, because he seems to have known he was dying. He wrote to his sister about death, and he knew that death would not be far away. I mean, that could just be an old man, but he wasn't that old. He was 68, 69, so I don't know, and it's tantalising. And, of course, his death certificate, you know, you just can't get any closer. So I'm sorry, one of the big mysteries. Yes?
You emphasized how little money he was given by his family when he went to Italy. My question is, how was he able to buy all these things? I know he was a good bargainer, but how good could he be?
Well, they weren't major commissions. He couldn't afford paintings by real artists anymore, the sort of thing he had bought right up until 1841. He had enough, and he lived very frugally. I mean, this was a very large estate, and there were large amounts of rent. He didn't own anything, but his brothers sent him enough, and he was always saying, you know, send another cheque to Childs. He banked through Childs, and he had enough to live on, very frugally, and what he didn't spend on his living expenses, he spent on commissioning marble, or wood, or paying the craftspeople. I mean, that was what he had, but compared with what he had before, it was peanuts. So, you know, he couldn't buy great works of art. He could only buy copies that craftsmen made. But I think, as we've seen today, they were pretty okay. I'd happily settle for them. Okay. Thank you.